Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Rational Standard podcast, where we have mostly rational discussions about topics ranging from politics, news, and ranging across the world from the US to South Africa to really anywhere else that has something important to say about liberty. I'm going to be your host for this episode. My name is Morné Malan, and I'm joined by the hardest working man in liberty, Martin van Staden. Thank you very much, Martin. And not joined by David Ansara, but in fact joined by someone who also happens to work in liberty, and that is Zakhele Mthembu. Zakes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Nice to have you here. David is off selling cryptocurrency at the Adopting Bitcoin conference. So good luck to him.
Wasn't he restarting the Silk Road? That's what I heard.
Wow. I don't think the Silk Road ever stopped, Martin.
No.
It never stopped. And most importantly, the ideas behind it, right? You can't stop those, right? That's the whole thing. I think.
And now that Ross
was trying to.
Yeah, now that Ross is out again, maybe he can give it another boost. So.
Yeah. I doubt he'd want to. I wouldn't want him to. I think he's earned normalcy. He should just chill.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, he should just chill.
Yeah, I saw one meme that said that Trump has incredibly cruelly dictated that Ross Ulbricht was now going to be condemned to having to take part in libertarian podcasts for the next 20 years.
Yeah, forever now. For
a burden he'll have to bear.
So it's a light burden. I'm sure he'll look back like, a cell and having to be hailed as a hero forever. I think I'll take the latter.
The statue of Ross outside the LP headquarters. That should be the next
true. Yeah. The one of the first true political prisoners, a clear political prisoner. So that was cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, fair enough. Okay, well, there's plenty of happening. We already already alluded to Ross Ulbricht. On the US front, there's Trump rearranging the alphabet. It's no longer DEI. DEI is now DIE. And we're seeing the reactions to that. But locally, we've also had a huge shakeup, which was the adoption of the Doomsday Act. We were told that we need to have a GNU coalition to avoid a Doomsday Pact, which was a coalition between the ANC and the EFF or MK, or both. And now we're having to confront the Doomsday Act. The Expropriation Without Compensation Bill has been signed by President Ramaphosa. It is now law. And I'd just like to get your guys' reflection on that. Maybe, Zakes, I'll start with you. Just to give your sense of what this means either politically. Well, maybe just start with what it means for property rights in South Africa, why it's important not to have this act, and why it's important for people to resist it, for rational people to resist the implementation of the act.
Of the act, right? Yeah, no, it is threatening in in the normal sense that expropriation is threatening, because the act, right, is pretty much according, if we take the argument that is presented, because I always like to strongman even my opponents, or especially my opponents, right? So the act is a revision of the Expropriation Act of 1975, which really, fundamentally every constitution has this. It gives the government the power to expropriate. The sticking point really with this one is that, it gives the government an ability to expropriate without any form of compensation, right, for a property owner. Of course, that is extremely problematic because, property owners, would like to be paid when their, property is taken. In normal cases, expropriation happens for things like, for various things, the public interest too, because there are cases like where the public interest includes roads or maybe the building of any public institution, right? And then in that instance, if you have, a property that is in the way of a planned national highway, for instance, the government would then pay you for your property and then they would expropriate it and use it for whatever, right? And with this legislation, that ability for payment, right, would I wouldn't say be eliminated, but it would be heavily curtailed. There would be a possibility that you would not be paid, which is not something that should happen, right? Ordinarily, that is quite threatening to your rights, to your property, because it means that the state can decide to just take your property and, leave you with nothing. And your property is really fundamental to you exercising every other right that you enjoy. And the reason given for this, of course, I think it has been stated even when the bill was discussed in Parliament, and even when it was signed yesterday, it was, for transformation, for redress, for, the land question as it is in South Africa. I think that is the central point and the central thrust of the argument, right? So that's why the state wants to expropriate property without the prospect of compensation, because it believes that, the people who own that property should not be owning that property, right? And this will be done in a manner that does not have any form of verifying whether, it is true, whether those people should not be owning said property or not, right? And that cannot happen outside of some form of adjudication. And, the legislation seemingly wants to bypass that and just grant unilateral powers to the executive to make these determinations. And I want to make this clear because, the actual justice aspects of, property rights is something that is extremely important to me. I can spend the whole podcast talking about, my theory of justice with Nozick and how, justice in acquisition, justice in transfer should be justified. But I also, the protection of property rights necessitates that all these determinations, particularly determination of justice on whether, certain property belongs to A or B, that should be subject to, an adjudication. The people who own the property should be able to, have a say. But I think according to the legislation, formally there is a requirement for negotiation and all of those things. But as to your question, Morné, I'm sorry for dragging on, but as to your question, why is it a threat? Well, they can take your property and give you nothing. That's why it's a threat, right?
Yeah.
That's the fundamental.
I actually want to pick up on that. And Martin, I think it would be good if you could use your juridical skills to explain to me, to explain to the audience how it is that the Act actually allows for expropriation without compensation, because for those of you who don't know, there was actually quite a long process some years ago. I think it must have been over 5 years now, where there was an attempt to change the Constitution, to change Section 25 of the Constitution, which necessitates compensation whenever there is expropriation, and that is sort of the norm throughout the world. Just to add on to what Zakhele said there, the norm throughout the world, the reason why most countries do have certain provisions which allow for expropriation is because every now and then there might be a public interest concern, but those are usually public interest in the sense of access to water, or in the sense of having to lay power lines or something like that. So really primarily economic interests, but as Zakhele said, that really doesn't form part of much of the discourse so far in debates about expropriation in South Africa. It's mainly redress. And just to, again, link up with what Zakhele said, I think you obviously have to note that where it can be proven that government previously or previous government had encroached upon the property rights of certain people, then the restitution can be justified. If there's a clear case where property was expropriated illegitimately in the past, then there's a clear argument for some form of redress. Then the main thing would be the actual proof there, and of course, making sure that that actually goes back to the original owner. But I think that sort of goes back to the fact that even within the rhetoric of the pro-expropriation people, there's sort of an underlying acceptance of the notion that property rights are important. It's bad that land was stolen because the property rights of the people who owned that land ostensibly were negated by the state. And that's merely being used as an argument to do that again. But yes, Martin, just on that point of expropriation without compensation, how does the Act actually do that? And really, anything else that you'd like to say on this point, just go for it.
Yeah, so there's a long story, and I'm going to try and kind of say it in summary form, but I have to kind of start in kind of historical times, and that is with the state, like Zake said, has always had the power to take property. Now, the state is an organization of violence, of coercion. That is its characteristic power. And for the longest time, the state simply took what it wanted. It killed who it wanted, and it did absolutely whatever it wanted. Now, that changed, let's say, in the last century, 2 centuries, when the idea of constitutionalism came about, this idea that actually the law must also apply to the state. And that means that, yes, the state can do these things, but it must do so legally. And that is what expropriation is. Expropriation is a legal institution that recognizes that forever the state took what it wanted, but now we want it to be done legally. Now, the guy who introduced this idea, he's probably not the only one, but Hugo Grotius, known in natural law thought, he said that this is what it is. This is eminent domain. This is expropriation. The Brits call it compulsory purchase. And necessarily part of this idea of expropriation is the payment of compensation. There is no expropriation without compensation. It is a contradiction in terms. If the state wants to legally take property, if it wants to expropriate, then it must pay compensation. So that's the kind of the theory of expropriation back in history, and that's something that legal systems have then adopted and recognized.
And just on that point, it's compensation above market rates as well, because the norm is actually that you have to also take into account that it might be it's forced purchase. So you have to take into account the fact that the coercion itself also necessitates additional payment. So the norm is not only compensation but above market rate compensation.
Yes. So why is that? And that is what Zake also alluded to earlier. The state has various tools at its disposal to do things, right? 2 of these are criminal law, and the other one is the law of delict or tort law and so on. This is when someone does something wrong. Then they get punished. They can get punished criminally or they can get punished civilly. These are the state's 2 legal options, and the other things are all extra legal. Now, expropriation does not exist in these 2 categories. Expropriation, as Zake said, is something that's if the state wants to build a highway and it sees, oh, there's a guy's house, and it's like, damn it, this guy is basically in the wrong place, and that's unfortunate. He is not to blame for that. He is the owner of the property is caught up in some circumstance that the state has an interest in overriding, and the state then goes and says, listen, we have to take your property. Sorry, nothing we can do about it, but you are not to blame. We are not punishing you. You have done nothing wrong. If you had to be punished for something, or if you did something wrong, then we would prosecute you or we would institute civil proceedings against you. Those are the options. But you have done nothing wrong, and therefore we are going to give you the market value of your property. But not just that, because you did not decide to sell. So you holding on to your property means that it has above market value to you. Otherwise, you have sold it. So we're giving you solatium. The Latin term is solatium, that is payment for inconvenience caused or payment for the disruption or whatever. And the 1975 Act did provide for solatium. So let's just fast forward into where we are now in South Africa. The Constitution is enacted in the 1990s in recognition of the massive deprivation of property rights that the previous government inflicted upon ordinary South Africans. And it said, we're not doing that anymore. All South Africans now have the right to private property, and that includes when their property is taken, and firstly, their property may only be taken by law. So all the other methods that I spoke about that the state can use to do things, that has been closed off now. The property may only be taken by law, and therefore, if property is taken, it must be expropriated. So if the state expropriates, it must pay compensation. This is section 25.2 and 25.3 of the Constitution. It says that when there is expropriation, there must be compensation. Now, the Expropriation Bill of 1975 was amended various times. It wasn't kind of stuck in the apartheid era. It's been updated in between. It had solatium, it had various kind of recognized limitations on the expropriating power, but still, now we have this new Expropriation Act. What does it do? It says that the constitutional standard of the payment of just and equitable compensation, that applies, but under certain circumstances, the payment of nil compensation may be justified. Now, what happened here? The government started this narrative years ago, and it spoke about expropriation without compensation. As I said, that's a contradiction in terms. It doesn't exist. Now, a bunch of legal scholars in South Africa, all of the radical left, said, hey, guys, geez, you can't say that. It's a contradiction in terms. You have to say expropriation for no compensation. What does that mean? You are being compensated. The Constitution says you have to be compensated, so you are being compensated, but to the amount of 0 rand. You have been compensated to the amount of 0 rand. And these people make this argument without kind of any shame, and they act like this is just normal. The kind of euphemistic abuse of constitutional language. It's like saying the Constitution says you have the right to life. Okay, we define life as death, and therefore the Constitution actually says you have the right to death. So now we're going to kill everyone. Okay, I guess that's fair. It's like that's what we're dealing with this act. It redefines. It takes constitutional language and it says, actually, not really. So now it says property may be expropriated for no compensation. It pretends to have a closed list of circumstances under which that may happen, but actually it's an open list. So in effect, what has happened is that the Expropriation Act now says that government. The other important thing is it takes away solatium. It doesn't just say they're allowed to pay above market value. It says that the fact that the expropriation is involuntary may not be taken into account. It prohibits solatium. That is evil. That's pure evil. So that's what the act does, and then it says that the government may choose to pay nothing effectively, and that qualifies under the Constitution. So it's not going to be like all property is now nationalized or the government is never going to pay any compensation. It's now just an option that the government may rely on when it chooses. But that is enough. That's bad enough, because now it's on the books, the power is there, and whether it's used or not is actually, well, it's not irrelevant. It's very relevant, but it's kind of beside the point, because the minister may choose to use it, and that's something that should be condemned, because what distinguishes Venezuela from the Dominican Republic, what distinguishes South Africa from Zimbabwe, what distinguishes North from South Korea, is always private property rights. It is always that thing. It is the absence of secure private property rights that turns a South Korea into a North Korea, that turns a Colombia into a Venezuela, that turns a South Africa into a Zimbabwe. It's always private property rights. And as both you and Zakes alluded to, this has nothing actually to do with redress, because redress is provided for in law. It's always been provided for in law. If someone can show that their property has been taken, they must absolutely, of course, receive that property back. There is no one is debating that, and that's one of the things that people in this discourse have to take into account, because a lot of the enemies of property say that, they just don't want redress, these opponents of expropriation without compensation. But no one is saying that. No one has ever said that. AfriForum, the IRR, the FMF, everyone says, yes, restitution must occur. Of course it must occur. And of course compensation must still be paid, because you are a blameless owner. Whoever took the state took the property 2 decades ago. You have done nothing wrong. You purchased a piece of property thinking you're doing it in good faith. You can't be punished by the state for that. So of course you have to be compensated by the evildoer who was the state. This is all just a power grab by the South African government. It's not a racial thing. Race is being used as a kind of a justificatory mechanism for it. But as we've seen, the state, when it expropriates property to redistribute, it keeps ownership of the property and it leases it out. It never gives the agricultural property to people in ownership, and then sometimes it kicks those beneficiaries off the land and gives it to cronies. So this is a power grab by the state, and it's doing it in the most basically anti-constitutional way, not just unconstitutional way, but an anti-constitutionalist way possible.
Yeah, and I think that that's just another clear indication that what we're not talking about here is restitution in any meaningful sense. Restitution would be we've identified an actual owner and who was deprived of property illegitimately, and we shall return it from the current owner to the legitimate owner, subject to some form of compensation. But we all know that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about instead of having people own property, they'd like to own that property themselves. And just on that null compensation thing, what's that? The 1984, is it war is peace, freedom is slavery? It's null compensation is compensation. It's we are now living in Orwell's universe, or I think they'd like to put us in Orwell's universe. At least, but I don't think everything is lost yet. But just on that point of you sort of mentioned the differences between those various countries: South Africa, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Dominican Republic, North and South Korea. I mean, that was also the subject of the work done by I'm going to butcher the name here. It's Dan Sulungu and his partners, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, who basically said that when it comes to distinguishing between nations that fail and nations that succeed, two of the most clear indications are, firstly, property rights, the extent to which property rights are actually being protected, and secondly, the rule of law. And I think that on those two scores, this law is the most dangerous thing that one could imagine. It doesn't respect property rights in any significant sense or in any substantive sense, and it doesn't respect the rule of law, which says that there are certain provisions which are not only, or the citizens are not only subject to, but the government itself must uphold. The government itself is beholden to laws and cannot act beyond those values, and that's what a rule of law is. But Zake, so I want to get back to you. I mentioned it at the beginning, just in relation to the political landscape in South Africa. And one of the arguments for the current government of national unity was basically that we'll avoid things like the NHI, things like the Basic Education Amendment Bill, BALA Act now, because that's also been signed, and EWC, or the Expropriation Bill. We've now gotten all of those, and it seems as though the argument at the moment is basically just that, well, yes, we do have this, these chemical weapons or whatever, economic chemical weapons that we could use, but trust us, we're not going to. Trust us, we've got the right people in place. So yes, I do have this weapon to destroy the economy and to ruin people's lives. But don't worry, I won't use it, or I'll only use it responsibly. And so just on that point, what does it mean for the political landscape, and what does it mean just generally on the fact that, it's not necessarily who has the power, but it's the fact of them having the power. I mean, that's the message of the Wizard of Oz, is that, he was a very good man, just a very bad wizard. And I think the point of the whole thing is that it doesn't matter whether you're a very good man or a very bad man. We don't want a wizard who attempts to control everybody's lives. But Zakes, on the politics and on just the general notion that what's the old saying? Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome.
The outcome, yeah. No, man. The politics will be interesting. As we were talking before the podcast with Martin, I think that, the ANC is calculated because it knows why it keeps on losing support base, right? Because it knows what the South African voting base, at least this is my opinion, what the South African voting base wants from it. And it will accelerate these things when it thinks that it is hastening towards its death, as it was the case when it dipped below 50% and had to, go into a coalition after so long having went past that. So I think that we will have to, for everyone, for people like us who don't want powers of the state that are obscene to be exercised, like the NHI, and things like that, we we aren't quite happy with the general political landscape, right? But in terms of the ANC, for instance, and people who are aligned with the ideas that are, propounded by the NHI and such, are quite elated. They are quite happy. Like, if you look at the motivations for MK, right? Jacob Zuma in his, speeches says that he left the ANC because he loves the ANC. That's why he still insists on being an ANC member. He says he wants to save the ANC, which is a very, but let us take the rhetoric as it is, right? He is pretty much saying that the policies he advocates for were policies that were once supposed to be advocated for by the ANC, meaning that he is a splinter of the ANC. Quite literally, of course, he was his president. Same with the EFF. Quite literally, one.
That's what I didn't leave the ANC. The ANC left me, kind of thing.
Exactly, the kind of thing, right? Yeah. It is this exact same thing, and the reasons those two parties. Well, firstly, EFF was a proof of concept in that a splinter party can exist because COPE, even though it still exists, but we can all agree that it is a political non-starter. But the leftist parties, and COPE is not even fully, to the right, if we were to use a very limited window. But, the leftist parties are the ones that keep on growing because the South African voting public gravitates to those ideas, right? So I think politically, for those parties and the people aligned to those ideas, it looks quite great. For the prospect of the GNU supposed to be a hastening of this, of course, it does not look good. But I don't think that the GNU was going to hasten anything rather than make it better. Right. I'm like, as we're speaking in that, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but as we're speaking in our event, right? And as I mentioned that, like, we should think of what would it be had the GNU and the people within the state not been there right now, right? Like, so that is always the contrast, because these things, if they were going to happen, were going to happen. The ANC, like the expropriation was passed by Parliament in this previous sitting. Right, not in this current sitting with a newly constituted, seat structure and all of that. So, like, these are bills that had already been passed. We were just awaiting signature. So now we should think of what would it look like if they were signed in the previous administration and with the previous cabinet and things like that.
Yeah, but
politically it does not look good for the GNU. I think, really it should be scrapped. Like, everyone should just go their separate ways. They tried, and they should just try and vie for positions on their own. And this is coming from me, someone who thinks it's a good idea. But, like, really, it'll get to that point, because now the parties involved in it will be suing, the states that they are also a part of. It'll be a very interesting thing.
Yeah, but that's sort of my question. Is you understand I sort of understand the ANC's motivation. MK, I'm not always sure what it is that actually motivates them. I saw just this morning actually that they were they were profusely positive about Donald Trump in America. So I'm not always sure where the MK stands on really anything. EFF, I think we all sort of know what their ideological foundation is. But what about those other parties? Basically, all the parties that are in the GNU, they're not necessarily driven by these leftist politics and all those sorts of things. How do they handle that? How does it affect them, or how should they be thinking about it? Or, is this a blow to them? Is it something they can work into their favor? Is it still the case that, this is super bad and we wouldn't like government to have a shotgun, but at least it's Dean McPherson who has the shotgun and not whoever would have been the ANC? Is that basically all they've got as an argument? Is, don't worry, it might not be good for government to have these powers, but it better it be us than someone else. Is that? It's not a ridiculous argument, but it's sort of, to me, incredibly convincing.
I think they are in a position where nothing really can be convincing, right? They are in a quite a difficult position, particularly to their base, because there's nothing that they can say that will make them come out of this looking great, which is why when you have no way out, go further in. And it's go. So I think they are going further in, because I was reading today an article where Dean McPherson was actually saying that he will use the act, right, somehow in a manner to protect property rights. So I'm like, that's the only way you can try and spin it, right? Hey, I won't abuse this. I'm here, better me. That exact same argument. That's the best that they can come up with, really.
Okay,
and I'm not even
Martin,
a huge political fan.
I think you should maybe get in on this as well, because I think if we are in a case where if it is the case that it's really bad and you've dug a hole for yourself, and that's the best you could hope for, or the best you could hope for is to just you're in trouble, so just keep going. Isn't that an argument for not going into the GNU in the first place? It's going to be bad for you, or it's going to be really bad.
So yes, that is part of it. But I mean, there's different levels on which you can discuss this thing. And for me, you play formal politics for a while. I think you have to start with formal politics, and you move on to litigation, and you have to do those things. But there comes a policy that is so bad where the answer is just no. Like, we don't care that you have a majority in parliament. We don't care if your constitutional court agrees with you. The answer is just no. So if we see anyone in the Western Cape trying to expropriate property without compensation, we will place them under arrest and we'll throw them in a cage. It's really as simple as that. And if we see anyone in Morné coming to expropriate someone's farm, we will place them in cuffs and we will throw them in a cage, because the answer is just no. It is not just unconstitutional, it is unconscionable. And it doesn't matter that you use the formal mechanisms of parliament to try and give this a legitimate garb. I mean, this is what the Holocaust taught us. History is there to teach us lessons, right? And I mean, we can say it's what's his law? The guy who they say you can never talk about Hitler again because it's forbidden. The fact is, history goes through these processes and it says, okay, something happened here. We cannot do this again, because just because Hitler used the law doesn't mean we can keep doing this. The answer is just no. If the law says the Jews will be gassed, the answer is no. If 50% of parliament voted for it, if 66% of parliament voted for it, if 100% of parliament voted for it, the answer is no. And you as a police officer, you as a soldier, you actually aren't allowed to do that. And if you do it, you are acting in a higher sense of law illegally. And therefore you may be stopped, you may be shot, you may be killed, you may be arrested, etc. And the question then is, which kinds of policies qualify as this? I don't think all policies qualify as this. I think that there's always a scale. It's a tough one. I think when it comes to taking people's property without any kind of compensation, I think that does qualify, because we've seen where that goes without exception. It leads to civil strife, it leads to famine. It leads to large-scale hunger. It leads to death in the tens of thousands. And then, so the question is, on the political scene, what must happen? What must happen is, well, whether the GNU exists or not, the Western Cape Parliament, the provincial parliament, must immediately issue adopt by majority a resolution saying that we take note of what the president has done, and we wish him all best speed. But whatever that is, it doesn't happen in the Western Cape. So go and do whatever you want to do. It doesn't happen in the Western Cape. So don't even try. Mngeni, it doesn't happen in Mngeni. Wherever someone else governs, the answer is we take note, but the answer is no. And yeah, I think that's where we are now. We can't be the only society in the world where the law always overrules questions of propriety. In the United States, when presidents sign assault weapons bans, there's many sheriffs around the country who say, okay, that's interesting, but not here. We see presidents signing immigration bans, then you have sanctuary cities that say, okay, that's cool, fine, but not here. Not here. So the answer from well-meaning politicians in this country must be interesting, not here. So I mean, it's tough, and I mean, if you're not willing to do the tough thing in politics, then I mean, I don't think you're actually doing your constituency a service. And I think the EFF, MK, they're willing to do the tough thing. Why are the other parties not willing to do the tough thing? So.
Yeah. Just I've been wanting to interject really on Martin, because there's an other side, right, to this argument, because always categorizing the other side as evil people is very interesting, because I actually happen to have people who believe in these ideas, who believe that this is actually justice, right? And you look at it in this instance, right, like initially in South, like given the South African history, the historical context, which is always the biggest motivating factor for the people who vote for the ANC and who stopped voting for the ANC and voted for the MK. So these are the sort of political kingmakers in the country, and the historical context for them is that there was no justice. There seemingly has been no justice that has been done for the initial injury of the dispossession of property rights. And then, it led to a recognition of property rights that ought not to have been recognized. And now for the restitution, ought not to be, because their foundation is in conquest, right? So we can all agree that a large part, the Cape, its history is founded in conquest, right? The Freeburgers who farmed outside of the confines of their little trading station did so in explicit contravention of the orders that were given by the Dutch East India Company. And that led to them having clashes with the indigenous populations there. And right now, you still have titles that emanate from that time that are recognized as just, right? And this is the problem. This is the problem, because now when you try to maneuver against that, right, this is coming from the people who advocate for this. And I see this because I'm also an advocate of, Robert Nozick, justice in acquisition and justice in transfer theory of justice. So the people who advocate for this are like, they see this as justice. They see this as, it is not an injury that is being done to someone. It is a correction of an initial injury that was done to us. So that always should be something that is considered, right? Because I don't think that we are dealing with monsters on the other side. I know we aren't dealing with monsters on the other side. These are people who seek justice. They, of course, seek it in a different manner that we disagree with, but I do understand where they are coming from, because primarily, even though, and this is something that particularly you and I disagree about, right? Because I also find, since I'm a proponent of Robert Nozick's theory of justice, the property rights that emanate from conquest aren't valid property rights. The main reason I have a problem with, the Roman conception of property, but that's for another episode.
No, but so I mean, we agree. I don't disagree with you on that.
Agree.
I agree with you on the Robert Nozick conception of justice.
And then this leads to, by the way, I'm sorry. This leads to the whole reason why without compensation is such a sticking point. And
but we concede that. So what I'm saying is that you can have an opponent who is well-meaning, right? And they have a correct position from which they are arguing, and they say there's an injustice here that we must cure, and then you say absolutely yes, let's cure the injustice. And then they say, well, no, we're going to add an injustice on top of it. Now, yes, you're going to disagree that that's the intention. But the fact is, we have conceded that, yes, if you can show, so let's talk about the Cape property that you're referring to. If this is shown, not a history book saying, oh, in general, there was some property. So it's like, no, you go, you sit in front of the court, you say, okay, here is my ancestor lived here in this area. This is the proof. However, and it's not just title deeds. Courts may take account of any proof that is relevant. You show that my ancestors lived here. They were put off the property that they owned, and then of course you must get that property back. You must get that property of your ancestors entitled back. But there must be a process, because the truth is not self-evident. You cannot go to someone and be like, oh, I don't like how pale you are when the sun shines on your face. Therefore, your property is illegitimately gotten because why I said so. You must prove it. And then, of course, if you have proved it, then you must become the owner, not the state.
You see, that's true. I agree with you. With you. And then the problem there is that it is like saying, someone who, and this much we agree, right? The property rights in and of themselves aren't just. that is what we have to operate upon, because
you
they
cannot
stem
just
from
deem
conquest.
that. You cannot just
No,
deem that.
but we aren't deeming that. We are looking at historical facts.
You have a rental agreement where you live right now. I cannot just say, Jake, your rental agreement is invalid. Well, because I said so, and someone a million years ago where you are now did something wrong. It's like, yes, of course there was conquest, and conquest is not a valid method of transferring property. But you must prove in the instance. You must prove in the instance. Yes, exactly.
Of course. And
then we don't
what
disagree.
I'm saying, where we do disagree, though, is that you say that it is deemed, and I'm saying that we can look at a normal historical current, and then we can decide. We can make a reasonable conclusion that a particular right to property isn't just because it emanates from property. It emanates from conquest.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We agree.
And we agree, right?
We agree.
And
but that's not what MK is doing. That's not what MK is doing.
No, but that's the thing.
That's
you
not
see,
what MK is doing.
Their rhetoric emanates from that. Their rhetoric emanates from that. Yes. There are certain rights that are enjoyed by certain people to property in South Africa that emanate from conquest, and they are unjust. Yes. And this is why it is unthinkable, unfathomable that one should pay compensation for the correction of an injustice, right? It is like, one seeking to compensate someone who bought stolen property, and that does not happen.
No, it does happen. No, it happens in our law. No, it certainly should. So if you go to a store let's say you go to Auto Trader and you buy a car, and that car happens to be stolen, you are entitled to receive your money back. You're not just, the law doesn't just say, well,
Auto Trader.
Yes, exactly. The state must pay. The state must pay. The state deprived the property. Yes.
And then this is why I'm trying to show you the thinking of how far these people, and this is why the argument for, I'm an anarchist, but this is why the argument for the South African state being extremely problematic in and of itself, why they find the constitution problematic, why MK are huge proponents of just entirely scrapping the entire thing, and this is coming from their legal minds, right? Because primarily for that reason, because the state, this current South African state that seeks to appropriate and expropriate, is the same South African state that dispossesses people. So I think, for them,
whatever state it is, whatever state having jurisdiction is the relevant compensating authority.
That's true. But that's the thing, though, that the party whom you purchase the property from is the relevant compensating authority.
Yeah, no. But if MK establishes a new state, if it claims jurisdiction where the old South African government was, it is succeeding to the obligations of that government in that area. Otherwise, it cannot claim authority. Then it must just say, well, we don't actually have authority here. But yes, I mean, that's technical, but Morné.
Yeah, that's true.
I just want to get in on...
Because the South African state that was created on top of the states that preceded it did not claim any other authority over the indigenous people. But look at it, it exists in the modern day. So funny thing, this technicality.
No, it claimed authority. It claimed authority.
No, it did not. I guess killing people counts as that.
Yeah, absolutely. It claimed the legal authority to do it. So.
Okay, wait.
Morné, what's
I just want to note just the actual dangers of conceding some of the points that you, Martin, particularly you, and Zakes, I have another question for you. But Martin, even in that case, remember when it comes to your car having been stolen, that car being sold to a third party, you're entitled to, or that third party who bought the car, he's not entitled to keep the car, but he is entitled to get. Yes, the third party who bought the car isn't entitled
the innocent
to keep the
third
car.
Party. Yes, yeah.
Innocent is the operating question there, and that's
why
determines in those
why
cases.
Is it a question?
Well, no. I think what the argument could easily be made that if you were in good faith buying a car and you didn't know it was stolen, then yes, you're entitled to compensation from the people who sold you the stolen car. However, if you knew that car was the car was taken by illegitimate means, so you were acting in bad faith.
Of course.
Then you're not entitled to any compensation whatsoever.
No.
So why can't I just make the argument that everybody who bought property, and we should maybe just clarify here for the viewers, when it comes to expropriation without compensation, and the reason why it's so it's clearly a topic related to redress is because those specific provisions are limited to land. So there's no
Sure.
talk, at least for now, at least not for now.
Yeah, for now.
Talk of expropriating pension funds or cars or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's particularly on this land question. But why can't one make the argument that clearly you have a case of the old South African government illegitimately stealing property, and any subsequent transfer of that property is clearly in bad faith because they knew.
No, but of
already
course,
said that conquest isn't a legitimate means by which to obtain property.
The state knows.
Illegitimately obtained and purchased with full awareness of the fact that this property was illegitimately obtained. You have no rights to that, and you have no rights to compensation for purchasing that.
No,
That is the argument.
so you're correct. You're correct. I mean, if you acted in bad faith, then you aren't. But that, again, this is what it ultimately comes down to, is you have to prove it. The law cannot deem you to be malicious. The law cannot say, okay.
You've already said that conquest isn't a legitimate means by which to obtain property.
No, but you're speaking in generalities. I'm talking about specific property. Show me plot B4 in the Kuruman district of North Cape, property Z4. Okay, cool. Someone owns this property. Great. So I have a hunch. I would like this property. I think this guy he shouldn't be paid compensation. I want the state to expropriate it for me and give it to me. I must now do the work. I cannot just stand on the hill and declare for into the ether that the Bobby who owns the property is a bad faith owner. I must actually do the work. I must go to court and I must prove it that this person who purchased the property or who somehow acquired the property knew that it was illegitimate. I must first prove that it was illegitimately taken from my ancestors. Of course, that's the first step. But then I must prove that the current owner illegitimately owns it. That's how the law always works. The law cannot declare you just because I don't like the way you kind of look, that you are an illegitimate owner, because that is the concession that we need to be careful of, because then that is transcendent. Then we can just say, a shipment of Huawei cell phones was stolen last week, and that guy has a Huawei cell phone. I think let's just deem him to have stolen it, and he knew, and therefore we may take his Huawei cell phone. No, the presumption, favorum libertatis, is a transcendent principle of law. You must always presume good faith. You must always give the benefit of the doubt to the victim of state force. So, of course, you must do that. And then if you
the victim of state force, who in the instance of this, you see, and that's the thing, right?
There can be more than one victim. There can be more than one victim. The state is never the victim. The state is never the victim.
The indigenous people, right, are the victims, and the indigenous people.
And the current owner would also be a victim. There's two victims.
Using Morné's thinking, right? The South African state was created out of conquest. So if you buy property from the South African state, you are acknowledging that you are owning something that came out of conquest.
Not all its property is taken by conquest. Why are we disagreeing on you having to prove something in court? Why are we disagreeing on this?
We aren't disagreeing on this. You are saying that these people did not know when you were buying a property in South Africa.
Stop giving me a case. I'm saying you have to prove it. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying you have to prove it.
I'm saying it will be the bar. It will be super easy to clear.
Just before we get on with that, Zach, I just want to hear from you. To what extent, because you've been making, I'm not sure to what extent you're actually making sort of a devil's advocate kind of argument, or to what extent you actually believe all of the things that you've been arguing so far. So
it's a devil's advocate
that you're agreeing with it, or is it just you think that it's more coherent than people?
It's a devil's advocate argument insofar as it does not intrude the aspects of Nozick's justice theory in transfer and justice theory in acquisition. And of course, that insofar as it does not intrude, they want to do this through legislation. As Martin says, I prefer adjudication, right? Because I do believe this would be a pretty easy bar to clear. But I want there to be a thing, right? Because all conflicts should be resolved through adjudication. I'm legal man, so that's where we disagree.
No, it has to be proven.
I genuinely find it to be an issue of justice. It is an issue of justice, particularly in this part of the world. It is the reason I'm a libertarian. It's the reason I love libertarianism so much, what drew me to it, because it is the only thing I was like, no way Nozick is saying this, because this is what I think. But yeah.
No, but to bring it back to the inciting incident, Zakes, no one disagrees with that. That's the point. It's a MK and the EFF.
I wouldn't say no.
Well, okay, there's no one in the discourse right now disagrees with that. The MK, they say that there's this group of people out there who is trying to, like, no, everyone says restitution. We have to do restitution. If you can prove it, you have to get the property back. Now, what we're disagreeing on is just compensation. We don't disagree about the justice. We don't disagree about the restitution. So, I mean, that's everyone agrees in this discourse, at least in this specific instance. On the Nozikian and Roth part, also emphasized this very same approach to property transfer and legitimacy and compensation, I might add. He said all of this in his Ethics of Liberty. So the libertarian position here is very much something that I think most South Africans buy into to 90%, to a high degree. But what I think you agree on, Zakes, is that MK and the EFF, the parties, are using this as a figment. They want state power. This is not about kind of having a landed kind of black aristocracy, which would be awesome. They have no interest in that. They want state power. They want the power of the state to be expanded so that they can dish out property to powers and kind of do more injustice in the name of the state.
On that, we can agree, right? Because I think the best example for that actually is Zim, right? Like, if you look at Zim currently, Zim is pretty much a crony state, right? If you are a member of the ruling party, you have access to land, you have access to farms. As we saw in that Al Jazeera documentary, you have access to literal gold, whilst, people are starving. So really, it is about that. It's about, this is why, because they're socialists, right? That is why, as Morné said, that it kind of always stops at, we take it, and not at we give it to other people. And instead, they sometimes throw the people who rightfully should get the property out and just give it to themselves, give it to a minister, so that he can throw parties every so often, right? So that is their motivating ideology, particularly those in power. And this is why it is unfortunate, right? But as I said, they use a rhetoric that I honestly, and a lot of people, it resonates with a lot of South Africans, but they are motivated by, their own nefarious reasons, which are socialist leaning, which is really more state power. They get to decide who lives where, who gets what, which is really quite an obscene ideology.
But okay, I agree. I broadly agree that this is more of an ideological thing and less of a sort of, I'm going to use the term because it's a sort of the term de jure, even though I think it has some issues, but sort of a black nationalist kind of thing. But I also like either of you can answer this, an answer to the question, how long does the bill last if Dean McPherson, the Minister of Public Works, who actually would be tasked with implementing the bill, how long does the bill last and how long does support for the bill last if he says, okay, as we all know, the state forcibly removed plenty of people from plenty of areas. Let's look at Soweto. Okay, here we have some white people who were forcibly removed from Soweto. We're going over to the Transkei. We have, and how long does it last if that's his approach? I mean, all the theoretical arguments still obtain. These are people who did live in a particular area, whose property was expropriated. They were forcibly removed from those areas. My sense, and maybe I'm wrong, is that that nobody would stand for that, because it isn't just about restitution, because those people are presumably just as entitled to restitution as any other person. It isn't just about state control, because there's clearly, because that clearly would state control is the same in either case. But my sense, at least, and maybe you disagree, is that plenty of people, there will be uproar in that case. People would not stand for that. What's either of you who would like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a simple answer. It gets back to my earlier point about this being anti-constitutional. If your law depends basically 100, whatever law kind of it is, if it's a hate speech law, if it's a land reform law, whatever, if it depends entirely on your minister being kind of circumspect with how he kind of applies it to, like, then you're dealing with a bad law automatically. And that's one of the things that libertarians always point out, is that we have too many laws that just are premised on this thing of good intentions on the part of, well, I mean, however you define good in the circumstances. But obviously, if Dean McPherson enforces it like that, if he says, oh, you know, actually, some colored guy owned a plot where Nkandla is now. He owned that 500 years ago, and then the apartheid government took that land, and somehow it ended up in the hands of the KwaZulu homeland government, and now Jacob Zuma owns it. And Dean is like, okay, we're going to expropriate Nkandla without compensation and give it to the colored guy's descendants. People are going to be like, well, he's acting in bad faith and he's abusing the law. But that's what the law is premised on. It is a fundamentally anti-constitutional law, simply because it is so reliant on the discretion of whoever happens to have to do the job. It should be a mechanical exercise. If you want restitution legislation, there has to be clear criteria about how it works. It has to give the judge the greatest possible leeway within certain bounds of recognizing established rights and so on. But if it just depends on the good graces of the government, then it's an anti-constitutional law. And this is a very good textbook example, I would say, of that, the Expropriation Act.
Yeah, and Zach, you thought you were doing devil's advocate. What do you make of my...
Oh, no. Your argument, right, is about, I don't want any minister, right? I don't want it being contingent on a minister's discretion that, oh, no, this person, you know, did this, or this person, this is in the public interest. I am in much more in favor, right, of it being a much more structured, as Martin laid out, it has to be an objective criterion that would not be subject to the whim of either Dean McPherson or Patricia de Lille, who was the previous, Minister of Public Works. So it should not really be influenced by who is in power, but rather the substance of the actual law itself, right? And, concerning that hypothetical that you raised, right, if a certain, if there was a particular, white person or their descendant, of course, but these people are long gone, and they're like, they took away, they moved you from Soweto, and then you had to move to a white only area because of the absurdity of the previous states, and now they made that a black area. Then of course, right, if there is anyone who feels like there is a right to that land, they then have to go and contest that. But in as far as that can be shown, then it would be justified, because this is just logical, right? You just follow the steps until you get to the person who has the just rights. That is the whole theory. Well, the libertarian theory, right, of justice. You just get to the person where you get to the point where there is no injustice in acquisition or transfer.
Yeah, but I was just the actual thing I was trying to test there was just the sort of the motivation behind the legislation, because we've had sort of a few different theories, and we've had a theory of they just want to increase state control, theory of they want to redistribute or to redress past injustices, but I'm just wondering whether, sure, I agree that if you apply that policy consistently, then that should obtain. But I'm just wondering if you can sort of guess, do you think that would be accepted generally as, because I agree that that's the logically consistent conclusion one ought to draw, but I'm just wondering if you think that's going to be...
They'll accept the law. Yeah, they'll accept the law. They will accept the law, but they will say Dean McPherson is abusing it. That's what they'll do. They'll say that this is an abuse of this law. So they accept the state power. They just won't accept it being utilized in that way. That's my thing.
So really, it'll be a problem of perception. But of course, I don't think they would accept that, right? Because in the thinking, right, in their conceptualization, right, of justice, that does not compute, right? Even though it may be shown through evidence and logic, because that is the case. And even though, because they are motivated from their own rhetoric that, justice has to look a particular way, right? And I'm like, as I told you, really, if you follow the process, if you think that if that is true, because really truth is only what matters. So if that is true, it will show itself to be so. And if it doesn't show itself to be so, then I guess it's not true, right? But as to your question, I don't think that they'd accept it. As Martin said, they would really accept the law. They would accept that these things should exist. But in terms of them practice like that, of course, they'd reject it. So really, they'd reject that decision and get someone else who'd just act in a manner that they'd accept.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of definitionally a bad law. If you, that's sort of the point that Martin makes, is we all agree he should have this power to do whatever he wants, provided he does exercise it in a way that we want them to exercise the power.
Exactly. And I mean, this gets back to the political question. And that's why I think that my earlier point was, that's why I think engaging on the formal politics of this, it only gets you so far. At some point, you're going to have to say, listen, there is something conceptually problematic here. There is something transcendently anti-constitutional about this law. So actually, we don't care that the president signed it. We actually don't care that Parliament adopted it. The answer is simply no. We are going to do the justice thing. We're going to do the restitution thing. We're going to do all of that. But what this act wants, the answer is no, because there cannot be another answer. There cannot be like, well, we want some Holocaust, but not all Holocaust. The answer is just no. And that is something that South African politicians, and I'm specifically talking about reformist politicians here because I alluded to this earlier. The EFF knows how to say no. MK knows how to say no. When Jacob Zuma went to prison, they said, that's interesting. I mean, yes, it's very interesting. But the answer is no. We are going to burn this country to the ground. That is the answer. So they know how to do this. They know whatever their conception, rightly or wrongly, of justice or right or wrong is. When it's wrong, they say, well, it's wrong, so we're not going to engage with you on this anymore. We're going to stop this problem. And that, to me, is actually the right answer when it comes to fundamental questions of justice, of basic justice. You cannot debate this. You cannot. Who said this? I think it was the former Prime Minister of Israel. You cannot have a discussion of someone who's come to kill you. When the robber comes into your house with a gun, you're not going to sit around and have tea. You're going to neutralize the threat. And this is something that South African reformist politicians have to understand. There is something called the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. That is a federalist principle that says that if a higher tier of government wants to commit injustice in your jurisdiction, you have an obligation to stop it. You have to stop it, even if it doesn't matter what constitutional texts or laws or some municipal what systems act or whatever says. It is a transcendent rule of governance that if injustice is going to be committed in your jurisdiction, you must step in. There is no enabling legislation in the US for sanctuary cities. There is no enabling legislation in the US for sheriffs of specific counties saying that they will not allow gun rights violations. They do that because that is just how it goes. You're a human being that has an obligation to stand up to injustice, and it's not about the rhetoric. It's about what is actually done. What is the state doing? Is it depriving people of their liberties? And that's always determinable. That's always clearly determinable, and you must then stand up. And because this is what people are now asking me, they're like, "What if the litigation fails? What if the political pressure fails?" Well, then it's either we accept that property rights are no more in South Africa, or we do the next thing, and that's the question. Do we carry on, or do we roll over and die? That's the question.
Okay, Zach, any reaction on that?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with Martin, right? And I agree that's really. I do. I really do. I think really the only thing that should be done there's because both sides, because I see this like so clearly. Both sides think the other side is committing an injustice. The people arguing for this in terms of rhetoric, of course, right? Eliminating the admittedly state power grab that, of course, these people want to do with this. I'm talking to the average grunt who will be really the one voting for the person who is taking this decision. perpetually, as they have a right to, of course. They, on their side, think the current status quo is an injustice. And they, too, have a growing sentiment, just like Martin's, of why are you passing this law, right? There are radical elements within the ANC, within the MK, within the AFF. We're like, why are you passing the law? Why are you not why are you negotiating with someone who committed an injustice against you, a historic one, right? So, and as such, in their thinking, this is really nothing. A law that says that you can negotiate with you is nothing. And these are people who exist within these structures and have power. So I think really both parties, because they always say anarchists are in favor of chaos. I'm in favor of liberty in that instance, right? So I'm like, if there are competing instances of justice or injustice, then let people be free. Because it will come to a clash, right? And I think it is increasingly coming to that, but it should be interesting. But in terms of, fights, I mean, no one wants to die lying face down, right? So I say fight. I say fight. To both parties, fight.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose, yeah. That's a good way of putting it, Zach. It's I think everyone sort of agrees that there was a past injustice. Yeah, I think it was just about everybody. Or there were injustices in the past. The question is, to what extent the process of redressing that injustice is itself an injustice. I think that's sort of the thing that we're debating. And to what extent it's prudent to actually apply that redress. And at what scope, I suppose, is the third question. Yes, okay, so that's everything on EWC. There was plenty of stuff happening across the world. Maybe just before we log out, is there any comment on any of the recent developments in the US or around the world, really? Trump signed, what was it, like 200, I think, executive orders around on the first day.
It's beautiful. Yes, a judge already declared it unconstitutional, that birthright citizenship nonsense. That's wonderful. A judge already slapped Trump hard, yeah. And it's, I mean, we were just talking about constitutionalism. And I think a lot of the executive orders by Trump are perfectly appropriate and actually good and decisive, especially the one freeing Ross Ulbricht. But when it comes to constitutionalism, and then we spoke about how the Expropriation Act is anti-constitutional because it looks at the plain text of the Constitution and pretends like it doesn't exist. The birthright citizenship executive order does exactly that in the United States. And we spoke about nil compensation and the bizarreness of a legal academic, without chuckling and laughing hysterically as they say it, kind of saying no compensation qualifies as compensation. In the US, they're like, okay, so the 14th Amendment, the plain text of it says that any person born or naturalized in the United States or subject to the jurisdiction thereor shall be a citizen of the United States. No, they say that the people who are against the executive order are ignoring that clause, and it's like, who is ignoring the clause? That is the key clause. It's the key clause, subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. federal government. Well, golly gee, and these people are saying that illegal immigrants are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States federal government because of what the guy who wrote the amendment wrote in some pamphlet. And it's like, you're conservatives. You're not living. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. The text is there. For the last 40 years, American conservatives have been saying we have to take the text of what it says and not read things in from this jurist and that jurist and this. Like, we have to read it because we have eyes and we have comprehension. That the 14th Amendment says subject to the jurisdiction of the federal government of the U.S. What is what?
Those words are there. You're just ignoring them. That's what their argument would be.
We're not ignoring it.
To the jurisdiction thereof must mean
illegal
something.
Immigrants are subject to the jurisdiction of the federal government. Of course they are.
Then who
of
isn't
course,
subject?
I cannot go to the US now, right, and illegally enter and then I'm in the US, and then the customs agents come and they're like, we're gonna detain you, and I'm like, haha, I am not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States federal government, so you can't touch me. You're not allowed to touch me because you cannot act illegally. Of course, you must act in terms of your jurisdiction. The U.S. federal government, like all governments in the world, the U.S. federal government has jurisdiction where? In its territory. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. We've arrived at what conservatives would have said 10 minutes ago. Every sovereign government has jurisdiction within its own territory. If you are born in the jurisdiction of the U.S. federal government, you are a citizen. This is the plain text meaning of the 14th Amendment. And suddenly conservatives are like, actually, this doesn't create the circumstances that we'd like. So let's ignore the plain text of the Constitution.
But why include those two qualifications then?
Which
born
ones?
or naturalized in the US and subject to. In other words, there are two conditions which have to be met.
Yes. Yeah.
So either born or naturalized and you're subject to. Why include that qualification?
Oh, I mean that's clear.
Really
No, I mean that's easy. That's easy. If you're on if you're the child of some soldier or some diplomat born in a U.S. embassy in China or a U.S. base in Japan, then you're still an American citizen because you're still subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. federal government in that area. So the U.S. federal government can extend its jurisdiction as it wants if it wants to add more citizens, and that's where it has extended its jurisdiction, is its own military bases, its own embassies around the world. So I mean, that's very clear why that extra qualification is there. And also the US has this weird thing with territories and unincorporated, like it's a very weird thing with Guam and the US they're not really kind of part of the US, but they kind of are. And it's like, it also would cover that because they are absolutely subject to the jurisdiction of the US federal government. They're actually only subject to the jurisdiction of the US federal government because they don't have their own state. They're not in a state. So, I mean, that would clearly then apply there.
A lot of those, the US citizens who actually live there or they're US residents, but they can't vote in elections or something like that. It's
weird shit, but they're definitely citizens. They're definitely citizens of the United States.
Yes, the same with some other, I thought Puerto Rico, there's some territory, a whole lot of territories around, around the United States where they have this very weird.
No, that's the 51st state. Yeah.
No, that's an actual state.
Yes, it's a full state, so there's no controversy there. I just find, and it's so unfortunate because what I yearn for is not just consistency. I mean, I think philosophers sometimes overemphasize pure logical consistency. I think there's something to be said for consistency, but if it just turns on a dime like this, you have this jurisprudential philosophy for your side. You're the conservative legal people. Okay, but now we have a conservative president and he wants to do a cool thing. And now my philosophy is kind of getting in the way of that. So let me actually kind of wipe all of that away. I mean, I just find that to be so, I mean, it takes all of the kind of interesting stakes out of politics. It's like it becomes postmodernist chaos. So it's so bizarre.
That's where I do disagree with you, and now I'm not just being a devil's advocate. The thing I love most about the American political system is it is super dynamic. Things can change on a dime. This was the case 4 years ago. Now it's completely different because there are these huge shifts in policy. And you actually get an opportunity to say, now we're going to try this policy. Now we're going to try that policy. And if this one is bad enough, we're not going to try it again. And if this one is good enough, we'll keep it in place. But
that's a principle.
Between our system and the American system, for instance, is that the American system actually has this clash of ideas, which is not just a theoretical clash of ideas. It's a pragmatic clash of ideas that's constantly taking place. There can be a huge shift. Whereas in South Africa, after election, what's going to change? Absolutely nothing. And that's true whether it's been the ANC for 30 years or the ANC plus 10 other parties, because there's just this monolithic drift in one direction, regardless of what's actually happening in the country.
No, I don't disagree with you. I like the dynamism. I'm just saying what this is not dynamism. I think that what you've explained is a principle. It's like, okay, we're conservatives. We believe, let's try this. Oh, geez, it didn't work. We're still conservatives, and it's still consistent with our philosophy to try something else. I'm saying that it's, I mean, we've had this discussion before, I think the three of us, is this team sport kind of mentality, in that actually principles don't matter. It's just, is my guy in power? And even if he proposes something that conflicts with what I've been saying for the last 5 decades, I'm just going to go with it. I mean, I guess that's a dynamism of a sort, but no, I agree with you. I think the US has good dynamics, and I enjoy that, and we lack that in South Africa. But I don't think this is an example of that. I think this is team sport chaos.
Yeah. What's that? I think it's Bill Maher that says that America only ever overcorrects. So it never corrects something that's gone wrong. It only ever overcorrects on what went wrong in the previous. But Zakes, I want to get to you.
That's true.
Favorite executive order? What you got? Whatever.
Controversial one. Favorite executive order? The US leaving the World Health Organization. Good nice. Chink off the fascistic armor, because I still have quite vivid memories of 2020, and it's very important too, given the global leader that the US is, right? Because now it'll be much more difficult to pull off a global pandemic where everyone buys in without the biggest economy in the world also shutting down. Because when the biggest player in town shuts down, then you, as little old South Africa, well, what are you doing? Keeping the lights on, right? Why? So you see now, since they've left, hopefully, although I think they said it'll actually materialize like a couple of years later from now, they are like actually leaving. But it's a great step. It's a great step.
Yeah,
and that was my favorite executive order.
I've been shocked with how broadly everyone agrees that it's a great step. I feel like maybe 5-6 years ago, it would have been a fairly controversial step. If he had done it in 2016 when he was elected the first time, everyone would have said, "What a ridiculous move." But then some stuff happened, and now everybody's like, "Yeah, maybe not the worst thing."
Maybe having a bunch of unelected, technocrats who get to decide the minutiae of your life is not the best of ideas. Next, we move on to the UN, and we try and fix that mess.
It's mission creep. As far as libertarians go, I consider myself more on the globalist side of things. But it's the way these organizations have just completely sapped themselves of any credibility through, like, it's the UN. It's simple. It's like, we're here to ensure international peace and security. That's what the UN does. Well, you could have fooled me. I mean, it tries to do quite a bit more. And the World Health Organization, it's like the concept of, we're going to kind of exchange scientific information, and we're going to talk about best practice, and their pandemic guidelines that they had before lockdown. I think most people said, "Hey, that makes sense. This is a good kind of guideline to follow as a sovereign country when you're facing an issue." But no, they're like, okay, no, actually, we're actually going to become like some
ignore everything we ever said. We're now going to say the opposite of
exactly,
that.
And they memory hold it. They deleted it, and it's like it never existed. But it's not just lockdown. It's stuff like consumer choice. The World Health Organization is waging a war against smoking, drinking, meat, standing, sugar, everything. Like everything that you as a consumer could possibly choose. The World Health Organization has an issue with that. And then if you say, well, let me try and vape and not smoke, they're like, no, you shouldn't. You can't win. And it's freedom is not a guiding value for these institutions. And I mean, if you're, I guess, I don't know if it's still being taught, but as far as I've been told, if you're training to become a doctor or a healthcare professional, one of the key kind of transcendent rules is patient self-determination. Like, we are here to advise what the healthy course of action is, but you must decide, because we can't tell you what to do. And that's that just went. So yeah, I love I agree with Jakes. The executive order pulling them out of the World Health Organization is great. I don't think they should leave the UN, because the UN can do a lot of damage without the US vetoing shit in the Security Council. So I think stay there, but turn off the taps at least. Stop funding these institutions.
I mean, according to Trump, really, the Security Council doesn't exist without the US, right? So that was his main sticking point. That, like, all these other parties who are part of the Security Council, should actually contribute more to it. So I think, actually, if the US were to leave the UN and the Security Council,
it's a gamble. Maybe it works, but it's a gamble.
Mm-hmm. But that's true. It is a gamble. If they leave the Security Council, Russia and China are now the biggest players in that board, and who knows what the UN does. But I think overall, it will be good.
The UN already has no power whatsoever. If you have the US pulling out of the UN, you'll just lose all legitimacy. That's my theory. Is that
if that's what's happening?
It's not like this is an existing institution that has power, and therefore it's better for us, or it's better for the US to be in the UN so that they can sort of influence the decision making. It's an organization that has very limited power, if any, as it is, and I think that if the US actually left it, then it'll just lose all legitimacy. It's already lost most of its legitimacy.
My worry is that, like Zach said, it China and Russia and others would then. So yes, the UN has no organic power of its own, but it's a lended power, and it lends credibility. So when some country does something and it's like, oh, you can't do that, the international community is going to stop you. If the UN says, no, actually, we have a General Assembly resolution saying that this is okay, that lends the aura of international kind of law to it, and then it can proceed. Now, you don't want that to be weaponized by Russia or China. So I would say that rather close the whole thing down, rather than kind of leaving it and hoping for the best to these other players. I think that there is a place.
A resolution. Let's say there's one country is committing a genocide, and we've all resolved that this is in fact the case. If that has any legitimacy, doesn't that at least necessitate some action on the part of the members of the Security Council?
No, but it does.
The reason I say that is because it doesn't.
No, it does. When
there was basically a UN resolution which found that Israel was committing genocide. Yet I did not see any Irish troops going into Israel to stop the genocide.
It's always going to be voluntary, but it does open that door. So the UN can't force you to do anything, but it does give you. I mean, the symbology of that is important. The same happened in Zimbabwe when Rhodesia was when the Security Council adopted mandatory sanctions against that country. That led to that country being kind of bled dry until the transition to majority rule in 1980. So it's a thing. It's a thing that happens. They could have done it voluntarily on their own. The countries could have cut Rhodesia and Zimbabwe off from international trade on their own. Sure, they could have. But there was this step through the UN that then did lead to some action. And then, of course, you have the war in Korea. That was a UN-led operation, the first and the last. But, I mean, there is that residual kind of influence that it lends things. I think we agree that it's largely symbolic, and it depends very much on whether a country buys into it. But I think it's still a factor. And I think it's you shouldn't discount auras and the kind of lendings of credibility and so on. I agree with Israel. It's complicated, so it's definitely not. It didn't play out the way that the General Assembly thought it would. But I would say if Irish troops were to go to Israel and were to attack Israel, they would have that backing. They would say we're acting in terms of an international mandate. And if Iran just randomly invaded Israel,
I don't think people really do. I mean, China could have said, well, I mean, there's a resolution that said there's genocide.
They can.
Yeah,
so
the
resolution gives it.
China could do that. Russia could do that. Anybody could do that.
But not without the resolution.
But nobody does because No, but there was a resolution and nobody did it.
No, exactly. But so they have the choice. They have the
Because
choice.
the resolution means nothing.
Not on its own, no. Not by
because
itself.
because the US does not agree with the resolution. I think I agree with both of them. I just think that, like, I agree more with Morné. I think that the reason that the UN has this aura of international, like, pressure is because the United States has been a foundational parts of it since its founding, right? And because and this was coming after, like, wars that the US had really kind of crushed. Oh yeah, can we say the S word?
Well, we have now, so.
But yeah, it came from a place where the US, had really, done amazing stuff internationally. So I think it had always really been a vehicle just to spread the US geopolitical influence. I think that the reason, to answer Morné's point, the reason that, like, the resolution in Israel, no one did anything about it is because, well, the United States government gives weapons funding and, sells weapons to Israel. So they're like, you go fight Uncle Sam.
I don't disagree.
Once Uncle Sam leaves the UN, then that aura of, like, it really becomes a BRICS. It becomes another BRICS. And really,
that's what I disagree with. That's a gamble. I don't disagree that that's probably the case, that the US is what gives the UN whatever legitimacy it might pretend to have. I'm saying that, am I willing to say, well, I'm so certain of that the US, I know that when the US leaves the UN, the UN will become absolutely meaningless. If I had that certainty, I'll be like, yeah, absolutely. Just sign the executive order, leave the UN. I have some uncertainty about that. I think it's probably right. But I think that it could happen that the US leaves and Russia and China are like, well, okay, geez, this changes things. So let's deal with it, and then they weaponize the UN into something kind of different. I'm worried about that. So that's why I think maybe just cut off the funding to the UN. I think that'll be huge in itself, and then just let it die, and then you just close it down in a few years. But I mean, I still kind of conceptually believe that we should have an international organization that ensures international peace and security. I think that's a good idea, but the mission creep is the problem with the United Nations. It just tries to do too much, and if freedom is not one of its guiding values. I mean, if you read its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you read the UN Charter, it's all about liberty and freedom. But
and then you read the SDGs.
It's not all about freedom.
It's not all about freedom.
It's against freedom, the anti-freedom.
That's extreme.
Okay, I'm willing to. Can we all? Let's just all agree to. I don't think this is controversial. Maybe the UN has some persuasive power. Symbolism can persuade, but drones and tanks can end an argument. It's sort of persuasive, but the US gets the final word because they're either going to give them the final word or they're going to take it.
They're going to take it.
So the US has a transcendent veto. I mean, that's what I always talk about when I talk about the West as a power bloc. But you have to decide to use your veto, and I guess, I mean, this is a big conversation about geopolitics, but I think the West has, to some degree, begun losing its willingness to use that veto. It still uses the veto, but I think that there will be circumstances where the US voluntarily opts to not use that tank and bombs veto. So yeah, I think for now, just kind of maintain the status quo. But I think, in principle, I agree with that one.
Okay. Well, seeing as I'm the only libertarian on this podcast, my favorite executive order was the one that wasn't put in place. And that's all the tariffs. So a lot of talk of tariffs. So far, none of them have been put in place. There's a lot of talk about universal tariffs, a universal 10% tariff, or huge tariffs on specific countries, on specific products. To me, the best executive order is the one that you never see. the one that's never promulgated.
Let's hope he sticks with that.
Yeah, that's
There's no way.
I think it's still because the tariffs are very technocratic, right? They require a whole lot of like involved details of like what will actually benefit your constituents. Because I think there are people who love the tariffs.
You'd think so, but
yeah. Okay.
That's not my experience.
I was operating under the presumption that he would at least put some thought into them beforehand, right? Beforehand. But that's
it's the most beautiful word in the English language. Let's not qualify it by all sorts of weird provisions on when it's better or worse. It's crazy, like, come on.
Yeah, but it's been good, but I agree with that. Actually, I think that's the best one, right? Particularly, I live in the third world, right? When the US passes tariffs, it does not bode well for us everywhere else who aren't in the US. So
yeah, guys, it's been real. I see we're up over the hour and a half mark. I think we've gone through everything. We've settled every issue. People now have the rational answer to every question they might have. If you're watching this right now, use the comment section to tell us how wonderful we are. Share it to your friends and tell us how right we are. And if you don't agree, then really ask yourself some serious questions. I mean, this is literally the rational standard. So if you're not agreeing, then I mean,
it's in the name.
It logically follows that you're substandard in your rationality. Okay, guys.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks
for
Have a nice weekend.
joining.
Cool. Thanks for having me, dude.
Yeah.
Alright.